Thanks, Neha, especially for that really long introduction of mine. Uh, so the idea here is that you have on stage the five of us who've got about, say, at least around 20 years of experience of looking at cities through various lenses of our practices. Uh, I will try not to be a moderator because I'm possibly the most immoderate amongst us. So, but the idea here is to have a conversation amongst ourselves. Uh, in the context of the conscious collective, the challenge here is in about an hour's time, we need to kind of both explain our understanding of cities and sort of leave you with some glimmer of hope. And the reason why I put it like that is it is a disheartening, uh, mind-numbingly, sort of gut-wrenching process of participating in urban scale projects. There are few successes, many failures. So part of this is to try and understand from this panel, including myself, what are sort of personal journeys, personal processes, learnings, insights, pitfalls, and so on and so forth are. So, as a good moderator, let me start things rolling. Firstly, could I ask you all to keep your mics handy? All right. So, we've now kind of gone back and forth much more over the past 1 hour, but over the past few weeks about what exactly is the sort of common thread that connects our practices and our interventions in the city. One of the things that struck me when I looked across our works was this idea of mediation and negotiation as a sort of a primer or a sort of a initiation of a design process when one looks at cities. Now I know some of you have sort of a global sense of these processes because you're engaging with different cities at different levels, at different points in time, under different forms of urban governance. There's some of us who have also attempted to do it from a sort of a bottom-up process, that we start hunting and looking for negotiations at a geographically located community level and not so much negotiations with the state or with the urban government. So perhaps I'll start with Christian, because you're at the absolutely other end. What is your take on this role of negotiation, especially when you're trying to work on projects that are intended to kind of survive for a really long time?
Interesting, we had a discussion before we started the panel about how is the timeline of these projects. We discussed in between us that very often these projects have a timeline of 10, 15 years. And it is very vital for this, we experience that they are not static processes. Because what is true over 10 years or over 5 years even is changing. The needs of the community are changing, the needs of real estate realities are changing, we need to come to a point where the master plan or the vision is fixed and has a good solid base, but we have enough room for playing, testing, try and error, and for giving chances for innovation in between. So not giving up the original vision, but to give the freedom. We talked about the different perspectives of that. It can be the involvement of art, it can be the involvement of young user groups, testing things, pop-up elements, and they can help us to come to a better result and a more up-to-date one.
So, because it's actually very cool that you brought it straight away to this question of a sense of time or temporality, or this idea that these sorts of projects are slow cooked over some time. Is that what is in your, how does one create this sort of elbow room to operate? How does, because see, it's, possibly the most critical question is, when do we get called into a project? Like, is it too late? Is it too early? Or so, what have your experiences been in this? Maybe Nandini, you want to give this a stab?
I think from an Indian context, in India, we are blessed with many, many stakeholders. We are used to our large populations and a tremendous cultural and community background. And so with that, we start developing, as designers, you integrate with various verticals all across to see what is that balance you can achieve to start a project, depending on its scale, its context, its typology. And that's very exciting. So right from the community level of immediately who's around, at the local, regional level, but we were also all discussing how the master of the arts is so much wider today. It's beyond architecture. It's gone into landscape and graphic design and photography and film, and that's what's so exciting. So your collaborations and this conversation really expands to all of that. And then together across this timeline, you have to have an incredible amount of patience, I think, and passion for what it is. But you see this incredible growth of projects over time with this collaborative force. And I think it's in India, it's always been there, but now we're very fortunate that we have best practice learnings from all around the world. And I think for all of us who work in India as well already as practices here, we have community and cultural learnings that date back, centuries that we can draw from and still combine it with a very contemporary aesthetic and build for the future.
So, again, that's the lay of the land, right? But a lot of what you said kind of almost implies that these have to be self-initiated processes, that as practitioners we need to kind of take that extra step, create these collaborations, and then sort of go to some sort of urban governance, urban management, privately managed urban spaces, publicly managed private spaces, that sort of role. So I just want to kind of try and perhaps take that to you, Giulia, that if I know we're going in a particularly order, and I wish we didn't have to stick to this, but maybe this is just the first round, is to try and understand, because this is often something I struggle with, is that we've done all the right moves, we've gotten empaneled with development authorities, so on and so forth. By the time we are called into a project, it's perhaps there's not enough time and space to make these sort of processes and align them. So there's a lot of backpedaling we need to do while we're working on it. In your case, genuinely most of your projects are self-initiated. You go to governments with proposals, city managers with proposals, and you have the tough job of not only convincing them to agree with you, but to also find the funds and to kind of help you kind of get that project up and running. So what have your experiences been in trying to create that space, and when it's all off your bat?
Well, we go back to negotiations, I guess. I would say that, our path has been of 10 years, and I am seeing, an incredible difference from where we started and where we are now. I think that, India is, rapidly growing at many levels, and it's also a time where a lot of stakeholders from government bodies to also private stakeholders are understanding that the growth has to be sort of also more holistic, and it cannot just relate to our financial or architectural growth. So there has to be also a more sustainable growth. So I guess that our projects have been over time understood better. Of course, I guess that we were talking also about trust, and I think that at the beginning we didn't have much to show because we were just starting out, right? Now I think that we've got the trust, especially of government, because of course there is always the responsibility of what would you put out in public spaces and who's responsible for it at the end, right? Because I can self-initiate my project, right? Our projects, but then who responds for it? And a lot of times we work within government properties, so eventually they will get the honors, but also possibly the dishonors, and the controversial sort of comments out of it, right? So over time I saw that the trust has been increasing, so much so also that other governments are calling us from other cities, and this is when the process actually gets a little bit more difficult, because we don't start from the grassroots, but we start already with a brief, and it's a top-down approach that changes things tremendously. But it's also interesting to do that as well, also to see what can you do like in a reverse approach where community like sort of comes after, right? And you have to sort of like run to deliver like an outcome, but what that means as well, because I think that there is also worth in understanding that process too. But I would say that yes, like it's incredible how in 10 years things are really changing, and I see a porous kind of understanding and desire of making such project in public spaces happening.
So, I mean, like, it's interesting that the conversation we are having is not sort of jargonized urban planning talk. It's trying to look at perhaps the more important layers of understanding city projects through the lens of trust, relationship making, sort of trying to keep that sense of being able to work with an institution over time, right? Kunal, with landscape and the city, it's a fairly conflicted mandate, right? There is like I mentioned, a certain hierarchy in which cities tend to look at non-human participants in urban space making, which is, say, plants and animals. Often that's not even part of that never kind of enters the thing, but arguably plants and landscape in a city is perhaps the most dynamically renewing, constantly available aspect of city life, which often struggles to assert itself. You'd spoken about this sort of idea of having trust and amongst collaborators, and this idea of sharing both authorship and ownership over projects over a period of time. So where do you see opportunities here? I mean, there may be lots of pitfalls, but are there opportunities at all where this could become sort of part of a new way of thinking about cities?
It's a good question. I would suggest that, yeah, I mean, in the past few years, I think the word collaboration has been used and abused terribly, where people feel anyone can collaborate with anyone and call it like a deal to make it happen. I'm happy with collaborations. I'm happy with associating myself with architects and urban planners and everyone. I'm even happy with doing it as an afterthought. But provided that there is enough room given even after that afterthought for that space to happen. And due to a lack of word, I would say landscape is not just about plants and planting. It's much more than that. As far as people and urban planners and architects and the bylaws understand that, then there's always going to be room for our field and for it to process further, I would say.
But do you guys feel that there is a certain sort of the problem here again is that, as we spoke about right at the beginning, perhaps even something that Rahul mentioned in his inaugural talk here yesterday, was this idea of a city being in dynamic flux all the time and not being a static thing. The fundamental problem with a document like the master plan, or with legislation, delegated legislation at that, like bylaws, is that they tend to be very static. They're not, I mean, what's the point of having a law if it keeps changing? Then how do you keep track of where that law is? So when one is trying to make a city more humane, to kind of come back to the original idea of why one would want to come and live in a city or want to belong to a city. Let's start with this idea of belonging. When the kind of basic instrument that we work with is static, it's deterministic, it's prescriptive, not descriptive. Into this space, you need to kind of introduce art, you need to introduce living things, you need to think about, precinct heritage, not sort of national or cultural heritage, but literally what is important historically to a location for the people in that location. How does one sort of, when one is, because a master plan document is a futuristic document, it is speculative, it is trying to create a vision for the future, where do we lose the plot in that process, where it stops being more about making a city more humane and starts becoming more about making a city more developed or more infrastructurally intense? How does one start creating these sort of inroads into thinking about cities at a larger scale from a government point? And Since
No,
you work with different governments, so what's your experience?
No, but what I think is the good news is that the time that we have also allows us to have in-between spaces. So we try to poke our clients, whoever they might be, to make a temporary use of spaces. And
How do you mean? Like temporary use?
no, for example, in Eindhoven we have transformed the former Philips campus, and there's in this space idea of transforming this over 10, 15 years. There's a room, physical room, like in this scale, that is not yet developed in the first phases. So there was room for temporary testing and laboratories, events like this, for example, also, but also on the very small scale. So in one of the electricity houses, there was room for a little cafe, and there was like it one thing lead to another, but suddenly there was an entrepreneur who said like, I want to try it.
So like a sort of a preview of things
like
to come by,
like a preview, and
proof
we thought,
of concept.
and we thought like it's actually nice to activate this plaza where people can have a drink, and now this is one of the very attractive parts because it became an adaptation in the plan, and it became a fixed function in the community. So other things maybe are only there for a short moment, but it's good that we realize that some of the processes are very static and others are very flexible, and we can in between we can mix things in as a preview or as a test, because we don't know always what is going to work and what is not going to work. So it's also a help for us to test and then to learn from this, because when it fails it's also not bad, because it's better when it fails as a temporary function than a fixed one.
Again, so that's another very, I think, important thing for us to understand when one looks at how we have to think about cities in the future, is this idea of a successful city project. What is success and what is failure? And this ties into other things that take these sort of decade-long processes that are works in progress. Nandini, if you had to reflect on, say, non-governmental institutions that your practice has engaged with, are the matrix of success different, or how does one convince a client that? And I'm doing this, so my experience is extremely cynical, because I come from a city which is actually controlled by a national government, not by a state government or a city government. So everything is a little bit heightened, just a little bit extra over the top. So I'm just trying to understand that, are there other natures of city institutions that we as practitioners need to kind of sort of partner with, or what I say, make allies, become allied with, in order to kind of fill the gaps, to kind of say have opportunities of not, because like in a government tender, government project, you have a plan, you finish, you hand over your drawings, there's a contractor who will come and do it. There is nothing there that stops and says, okay, now let's wait and see, right? It's very difficult to tell city infrastructure project managers that, let's do a phase one that wasn't envisioned in the tender originally, right? Let's try and do a dry run. Often it involves sort of authoritarian figureheads up top who no one questions, and then, the question of trust is you trust God. Like God says do this, you do it, So how's your experience been in perhaps non-governmental institutional?
So I think what we've tried to do with the practice is, of course, we were one of the earliest conservation practices. So again, being able to make examples of conserving buildings, adaptively reusing them, and doing that for our private clients, which then public and government organizations said, yes, we see value in that. Now can you come and do that for us? But what was really interesting, and what you mentioned, is what in the studio we call God of small projects. It's the small projects. And for example, if we're doing a larger building, we'll request that we do up the pavement and the surrounding areas around it, and that the company invest in that. And that's for the community or the larger basis. Or for BPCL, we recently finished their headquarters, but we requested we build up their art collection. And so we worked with about 100 artists.
Are these requests well received? Is it a fight?
It is.
It a...
Well, you start, I think for architects, it's always a fight. It's not a fight, but it's this question of developing trust, that they trust your vision, they trust that you're going to execute the picture. And now there is this identity and appreciation for bringing in these elements which are integrating beyond just a building. We're telling their story. So if you're working for a client, what is their narrative? It's no longer just the built form. It is the narrative. It is the story. How are you extending towards your city? What is the story you want to tell? So again, through these artists, through using sustainability, there was a story to tell, and it was supported. And they built this incredible collection, and we supported these artists over COVID. So again, you had these series of events that were setting precedents for the next project that came. And as he said, you may not always be successful, but from the failures you learn and you try again. And slowly we started incorporating corpuses in tenders. So we have an art corpus in the tender. We have a certain landscape or outside urban development cost in the tender. And that is then slowly adapted. And then once they've realized it's worked on this scale, they're happy to try it on the next project, or somebody comes, visits the building and says, oh, who's done that? Or thinking differently. So I think there is an awareness, and hopefully I think years of being able to do these smaller projects and smaller impacts can eventually build up to something that has a larger impact.
And I would like to add one thing, because I think that we as architects, artists, we are also storytellers, but we also need to understand who we tell the story to. If you tell the function of a temporary use to a real estate financial person, you need to tell the story in a sense of you're making
A
temporary
lease
contracts. You gain temporary income by this. If you tell this to the marketing people, you say like, you can tell a story about being cool and being a project that has a character of trying out things, and you're innovative, and so the different participants, you also need to sell the story, tell the story, but it is very good to invest in this. So we realize that this brings a lot of soul and new storytelling into conversion neighborhoods, even into new neighborhoods, where the people who come into these initiatives are very often from that community. So we don't bring them from somewhere, but it happens naturally from the surrounding very often, and that is interesting and makes it very authentic.
No, that's interesting. Like what I'm getting from this is now just, a lot of times when you do projects for city governments, for urban space making, there's this word that gets thrown around, which is proof of concept. So very often folks find that, in order to be able to do something in a city, you need to first tell people that this has been done before successfully, so it can be replicated. But what's actually coming across is it's much more about proof of commitment than proof of concept. You need to really keep showing up at the door and say, I'm still here, and I'm still enthusiastic, right? Kunal, the fact is that, it's already a struggle to try and tell city makers, precinct managers, city managers, that, cities are actually about people, they're not about roads, they're not about infrastructure, cities have to be kind, and cities have to accommodate different types of people, and so on and so forth. Let's look at baseline city use in a sort of lowest common denominator way, because often I find that very often the mandate given from governments and city managers is, it's not a lowest common denominator approach, it's like an ideal, utopic, top-down, highest aspirational approach, right? How can we the best we could possibly be today, right? And what happens is a lot of folks who are in our city, in fact, the vast majority of them, are not in cities to become part of the world's best settlement. They are in cities for other reasons. So it's important to kind of think about the lowest denominator. One of the issues that concerns you, and you've kind of shared on this earlier, is this idea of walkability, right? In, say, cities like Bombay that are very dense, where there is always going to be an argument and debate on whether, you know, is the idea of congestion or congesting a place or increasing the density and then ensuring failure of, motorized transit through that in order to encourage walkability, or are there places in the city where which are not dense enough to kind of match new parts of the city, urban extensions, where we find often that top-down mobility infrastructure is there primarily, and that's what kickstarts the development. There's no question of starting off with a walkability. So when you have to talk about or advocate walkability in cities, how are you going about it? What are you saying to people that helping you verbalize or advocate on being able to navigate a city on foot?
Well, I would say that the walkability of the city is directly proportionate to the health of the city. If you're being able to walk in the city, you're definitely going to be a more healthier person. I travel overseas at least 5 to 6 times a year. And every time that I travel, I lose weight and I come and I eat everything out there.
Sure, it's not just stress.
No. So, I mean, yeah, stress has also got to do with it. But I think walkability is, in my thinking, one of the most important aspects of planning, whether it's landscape or you call it urban planning. And the more the city adopts it, you're going to lead a better life.
But my point is, it's not a new thing, right? I mean, this has been the debate, like ever since we started building wide roads in this country.
Right.
The debate has been that it's not good enough just to walk. And over a period of time, this idea of walking has kind of fallen by the wayside, and you do it only if you're forced to do it. If you could move in a car, you would. So it involves a lot of sort of convincing people that the narratives that have been built over the past 100 years
Of course, I mean, definitely. Climate has got the most important role to play. I mean, you wouldn't walk in Bombay even if you had wide roads because the climate doesn't support it. We anyways don't plant enough trees. So there are a lot of things that lead to that thing. But somewhere these things need to get emphasized upon to ensure that we start with that process is what I definitely
It's interesting
feel.
you bring up climate change and, let's say, climate events, catastrophic climate events. Now, I guess, Delhi has catastrophes of another kind. I guess the thing that's kind of ruling the roost here is this idea of urban flooding, it's the idea of sea level change, sea level rising, the kind of fragilities it brings into the picture. Quite obviously, architecture, urban design, we are kind of the front-end people who are actually in many ways responsible for the problem, but also are the guys trying to fight it. There are other aspects to cities other than this. So there can be plenty spoken about this, but very often in this, carrying this conversation on story finding, story making, how do cities of the future accommodate ideas of identity, Giulia? Like when a space in a normal Indian city can be rural today, peri-urban 10 years or 5 years from now, and perhaps be core urban, like proper, like with a metro connection in about 15 or 20 years. So that's the sort of young adulthood, what I call the young adulthood timeline, right? Because it's usually people in their early 20s who are like asking radically difficult questions from their cities, asking of. So do you find that ideas of trying to look at installation art as a sort of vocabulary, let's say, a language? Because I know it's not like you find artists that are local. You find stories that are local, but they're not told by artists who are actually completely not local. So are there any insights and learnings about questions of identity, assertions of identity, and therefore territorialities? Like, for example, when a metro station allows you to paint its walls, what are the discussions and debates about what that content should be and what it represents and means?
Okay, I'm just going back one step because first of all, like, I think that what I do is very different from what you guys do because we act in a very light manner. We don't build anything.
One
We
paint layer
don't
thick,
build
one
anything
paint
too
layer.
heavy. Like we are very light and soft and also ephemeral. Going back to Raul Merotra. And I think that that's also what I really like about my work, our work, especially in the context of India. Cities are changing so rapidly, and a lot of times they are not really sort of like able to have that fruitful like network where everybody finds, like its own kind of space to articulate a sustainable livelihood. So a lot of times the interests that are predominating are the real estate interests with not a real master plan. So there is like just this like sort of like accumulation, and it's like a sort of like wild, wild west a lot of times. I mean, that's what we are seeing, especially in a city like Mumbai. Already for its origins and the shape that it has. So, I mean, I'm not gonna speak about the city, but like it's a very interesting sort of like a unique city for that matter. So we are very ephemeral. We try to inhabit spaces which are very important to actually understand the city, the complexities, and therefore the identities. One of our recent projects, which actually was the second edition.
Sorry, just to interrupt,
yeah.
if you could just elaborate a little bit about what is the nature of research that ends up with these questions? What do you think about when you start looking at this part?
So see, I mean, like the thing is that like we look at the city from like a sort of like very like walkable level. We look at the city not from like the top, We are not looking at the map.
Not a plan.
No, not at all. Like we just like literally go down. I mean, so and I think that walkability for us, it's a very interesting topic because walkability in Indian cities means social demographics. It means who am I and why do I have to walk? And a lot of times, unfortunately, we see that the richer you are, the less healthy you are because you do not walk. Of course, it's partially like the weather, it's hot. I mean, it's not really pleasant at times. But it's, of course, also like what we are making our cities and how we are making them, right? So we really go back to the fact of like bringing into a walkable space, which we make walkable for a very determined period. Unfortunately, we would love to make it like in a more permanent way, but very complicated in terms of funds and of course like government permissions and etc. So we try to make like a walkable space for everybody, which is why, like that gap in social demographics is really bridged. And I think that that's like what we really work on. And going back like to the ephemerality of like the nature of the project, I think that that's not like, a sort of like downside of the project, but is actually how you can switch on a light on a reality that is like usually unlooked, like unseen.
Under serviced or under recognized.
Exactly. And what is that reality? So we really go down in the streets, we walk, and we try to discover stories. And like...
What kind of a person does that? Like, that's almost journalistic, right?
Yes, it's sociological, it's anthropological, is urban. I think that we, like, in my team, we are all a little bit guide the board flaneur, which really like goes into this tournament and like we get lost, and then we find ourselves usually in the most stinkiest place ever, such as Sassoon-Dock. So we detour a lot, and then we arrive in really like the filthy places where we discover the best narrative. And I think that that's also interesting is the potential of abandoned spaces, because there are plenty in these like rapidly changing cities, and this is where you can really like in between, that those are the spaces that I think as a master like is an urbanist, are the most interesting, because they are like there abandoned because of multiple reasons, and they're just waiting to be reactivated. And for that matter, I think that a lot of like people that come to our projects, they are not even into art, they just want to walk somewhere. Seriously, I mean, like we ran a lot of interviews, and a lot of people are like, I mean, I don't know what to do on a Sunday. Either I go to a private mall, or otherwise, where do I go? So they just want to walk. Then they discover art and storytelling and identities. and sense of belonging and
But
etc.
what I think is important in that sense is again time. So and where we do this kind of interventions. I want to tell a short story. We recently had a visit of a delegation, and we showed them a transformation project that we did in Rotterdam, where we took out half of the original street and transformed it into a bicycle highway. And the leader of the delegation, he said like, this is ridiculous.
Where was the delegation
No,
from?
no, I'm not. No, I don't reveal. No, this
Come
is.
on.
No
You're
gossip.
amongst friends.
But the thing is like in a sense, from a perspective of Rotterdam, of the decision makers in Rotterdam, that was a given thing. We will discourage the traffic. We will give importance to biking because biking is the main thing and is the future in Holland, and we work a lot on these kind of projects. And it was obvious for this time, for this place, to do this intervention. And there's a lot of good examples in Barcelona, in Copenhagen, where this kind of transformations have been done. And now it seems something that is, in that context, very normal to do. And for somebody else, and from another cultural context, it is unthinkable to do this. So I think we need to show these kind of transformations, and we need to document them, explain them, show also the advantages of them. Need to show what you said, the conditions, like the walkability also needs, or the biking also needs the shading, needs the microclimate to do that in a longer period of the year. But it is not so immediate that you can make this. There's a time of seduction and explanation and testing and showing examples that work also in different contexts like here. And I think that we need to, again, it's a storytelling, and we need to take the time to do this.
So I'll try and pitch in here a little bit. It's about something we've been thinking about in our practice. We've sort of had discussions about this in various ways over the past few week or so. Is this idea of a city being sort of, there are certain kind of immediate binaries that get set up once someone starts thinking of a city. It's like a city which is anti-rural, which is not necessarily applicable in India, because in India it's actually rural spaces that become cities. The idea that a city is essentially sedentary because it's got to do with ownership of home, property, anchoring, staying put, and then figuring out how do I transit or communicate across the city to work and then come back. So then the emphasis becomes on transport, and then you have people who have transport and people who don't have transport. So I've often wondered whether cities are being misread in these binaries by putting this emphasis on, sort of, this idea that cities never sleep, they're always moving, and how that is something that is exciting and in some way enriching and economically, I know, like in terms, when you speak to an economist, if something never sleeps, that's a gold mine because it's always working. But I wonder whether our jobs as urban practitioners in city and placemaking is actually this question of pause. I know a lot of our works or our thinking can only be noticed and can only be understood and can only be communicated if the person who's engaging with us or our work is at a sort of not sedentary, not hyperactive, but has paused. So whether it means experiencing an urban space like, say, Azad Maidan with its rich histories, or even being able to take the time to read those histories, right? Or for as people who perhaps do stakeholder engagement, to kind of reach out and say, here's a story I want to tell you about how we can start activating the space, or making that pitch, or going with that self-initiative thing, is very much based on pause. So if, starting from Kunal, all the way down the line, has there been this idea ever, has this idea ever come in any of your works while you've been working at a city level, that actually it is both in terms of process and in terms of how the project is used by a city, that actually the inflection points are these occasions of pause, or temporary halting rather than a settlement or an anchoring. Does that make sense to any of you? Kunal?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just going to tweak your question a little bit because I don't do too many public spaces. I do more private homes. But whatever residential homes or private homes that I do are largely contained to creating spaces which just allow you to respond to small portions of nature, which could be just something as simple as sitting on a natural rock besides a tree and just listening to the rustling of leaves of a tree, and that could be very soothing and calming. Of course, there needs to be an appointment of pause in every space that you create, because that is what helps you introspect. I'm not giving you a spiritual answer, but any kind of pause is a form of rejuvenation. So 100%, I definitely believe, whether we are urban planners, landscape architects, or whosoever, we definitely need to create those kind of spaces. I'm also just going to butt in and give a short answer on what you asked Nandini about collaboration and whether it is privatization which helps you or whether it's also the government things, because I wanted to actually answer a bit of that, but it got lost. I'm going to give you one example where there's this association that we formed called the Bandra Collective. There are a lot of architects from Bandra who are involved. It necessarily doesn't need to be you from Bandra. I'm not from Bandra, and I've got myself associated. We took the liberty of associating with Mr. Ashish Shelar, who's a part of the Bandra Association also, and we developed the Carter Road. Very, very like-minded people, all architects from Alan to Sameep to Robert, all of us collaborated together, PK Das, and a lot of many people without any ego, and got this going, and I think we are very proud. I was the only person who was helping them from the outside periphery of Bandra Collective. I was not a part of it, but we all chipped in to give it our best, and that's a public space. And that's a public space that I feel gets recognized slightly more because it does not form the typical typology of the normal way of urban planning and landscaping. So I think it's also about being like-mindedness and how willing are you.
So sort of if I'm getting this right, maybe because you said earlier on collaboration is a much abused word, is a sense of an alliance, because that also means that it's kind of sticks. A collaboration very often we consider as architects to be on projects.
Right.
But does there need to be a deeper alliance, something, a sort of a proof of commitment that's beyond projects amongst like-minded people and so on?
I guess so, because you're in the field of creativity, so it's always nicer to understand borders, lines, who does what. As I just gave you an example, it's a little crass example, but I'll yet tell you all. It's like surrogacy, right? You know where the sperm is coming from, who's the womb, and who the child belongs to. As far as you know all those three aspects, then you're good to go. That's how we did the Bandra project, and we did it quite successfully, and it was government funded, so it was going through all those turbulent spaces where funds are a problem, but at least creatively we learned how to work together and get this space across, because that is the need of the hour. There's no other way of doing it, because any other way of doing it is obviously a failure already. I mean, I'm not trying to be negative, but it's not a failure, but it's not exactly the way we Indians would have visualized it to be. So I guess for us that was a point of success.
That's interesting. I'll park that question of occasion to pause. Maybe you guys can respond to that. But I find this very interesting is that, when folks, especially since there are so many here who are young, I guess, architects, designers, people who hope to have some impact in the future of the space that we occupy as cities, is that it is soul crushing. It is extremely disheartening. And one of the things I've learned by running an architectural partnership is that the idea that you have an ally rather than a competitor. Very often, our ways of getting involved in urban projects is through competition. So there is a certain idea that, you win this competition, there is some stature about winning competitions. But equally, once you won it, and then there is the grind of the project, which crushes your soul. Trust me, like nothing else. It's always good to have alliances, and those alliances may not need to be wedded through some sort of financial obligation or a contractual obligation. It could just be this sort of collective commitment to saying that, okay, these are the skill sets we bring to the party, let's go have a picnic. So it's that sort of approach. Very often that can help you cross that hurdle of, extremely rigid, highly structured governmental protocols, procurement, tender, so on and so forth. You guys can continue either along this line or along that question of pause, whichever.
I love the question of pause. So like actually in our next project, like we are going to have a pavilion that is going to be called How to Do Nothing. So I love it. Yes. And we still have to articulate better. We are really like working on how to articulate, like, how to do nothing and what to propose. Because you will have to propose something, right? I mean, you cannot leave like an empty space. Actually,
Like a folly.
Yeah, so like, I mean, we are
Absolutely
really
useless, pointless.
exactly. So this is what we want to do, like, and understands like when you don't do nothing, what is for you doing nothing, what is for me doing nothing can be two very different things, right? But how if we are allowed to have a space where everybody does their own do nothing, what happens? Because generally we are coming together always for a function. There is always a function behind. And in a city like Bombay, most of the times this function is very much connected to work. So also when you go out for a dinner, it's 90, and at least in my case, I don't know if you're luckier, but it's 90% of time work related, And I love my work, so it's completely fine, but there is a huge potential that gets just sort of like missed, right? Because what does it mean?
Absolutely, and there's one thing that you just said, I don't want the audience to miss out on that, is this idea of what you think is doing nothing is not someone else's idea of doing nothing. That can even be extended to this idea of leisure and recreation. Many of us talk about urban spaces, parks, gardens. In fact, the master plan is that the code is recreational space for green spaces. It has a function, recreation. But we often forget that that's actually a huge luxury, that it takes a fair bit of movement into the middle income strata of a city before you have the privilege of leisure, a privilege of recreation. So very often in questions of a moment to pause, that bench or a sort of let's meet for an ice cream on, I don't know, Marine Drive, some rock, something. Often those things are forgotten as being very important place-making places, points of intervention where you can enhance the quality of that pause, because it's a substitution for, having a Republic Day picnic or whatever. My references are all Delhi, guys, so it's...
And I must tell you that, like, and I would love to hear actually what other things about it, because I'm from Rome, so everything is pretty much a walkable public space there, and that's also the reason why I do what I do, because I love that dimension. And over here I was really, I live in India since 10 years, but over here I was really against under flyover regenerations. So when we were called to paint or to do any sort of like design intervention under a flyover, I was like considering it like as a sort of like hypocrisy, because I was like, the flyovers are horrible functional elements in the city, and they are brutal, and that's what they are. Why you have to beautify them? Then I moved to Bombay a year and a half ago. I knew the city pretty well already, but still. And then you go to Lower Parel, and you see that actually that moment of pause is just under a flyover, because there is no space. And so then I started thinking that, okay, the air quality, of course, is even worse than in other places, because you're really...
Someone needs to hold my beer if you're going to start talking about air quality.
Yes, okay. But like then you really review a lot of also your pre-concept, and like everything has to be so contextual in what we do. That's essentially what I wanted to say.
I think the word is pause is so interesting, because we do a lot of museum design, and when you're designing in the density of a museum, we always design for the pause. And the pause is actually a very poignant moment. It depends on what you put there, where it's something very immersive or something very meaningful, but it gives you that stop. And you very beautifully put it. What is that meaning of pause? When we're looking at a city like Mumbai or any city around the world that we design for, we're creating pause. So the beautiful work with Start is a pause for us in Mumbai. That is that moment we get to pause. So I think as designers, as creatives, I think we're always trying to see where our pause fits into the project, but its interpretation is always very diverse.
And I like your point about what is pause for one and what is pause for another. Should lead the discussion actually to the point like who are we to determine public spaces for the users. So I think it's good to think in a much more democratic way and a flexible way, to say like we just create podiums for people to determine how they want to use them, how they want to activate them or pause in them, and to make the space also for the future more flexible and adaptive.
Yeah. I mean, it's really amazing. There's this flash of a story that just came back to me because on this project that you probably see up here, it's these toilets that we designed in Odisha and Cuttack. One of the research activities that we did was whole purpose was to see how better toilet design can reduce open defecation. And I went with these two boys who were 15-year-olds early in the morning to see where they go and defecate, right? And it was amazing. They had this little YouTube, not Bluetooth, it was a little media player with two ear pods. And they sat connected by this wire, facing away from each other on the banks of the river. The sun was rising, the breeze was blowing, the birds were chirping, and they were having a shit. And I realized that now when I think about what it means when I design private toilets in villas and, you know, these kind of half-open, semi-open, interactive spaces with landscape, this is what I mean. This idea of leisure, the privilege of having a personal space of dignity for toilets, this idea of pause. I know those toilets that we designed would never replace that experience on the bank of the Mahanadi that those two boys were having. But I just want to leave you with that imagery. No, I don't. I'd like to open this up to this audience, and I'd be happy if my panelists and I can answer any questions.
Yes, I think we have time to take one question.
There? Yes. Can you get a mic?
Yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. I am more in the education space, not really design or urban planning, but always it's been an interest area. A few questions. So I have done vulnerability assessments in slum communities, in the Bandra East slums. It was for a project that Plan was funding for the Slumdog Millionaire movie. And of course, being in Mumbai, you can't ignore that aspect. So I just have two questions. How does it really work in terms of planning for low-income or slum communities, or are there regulations? Are you as urban planners involved in any decisions? And the second one is in student housing, because that's also something that, I've been realizing when you go abroad and you see a lot of the cities, and the university is such a central part of it. I happen to live right across from the Mumbai University at Azad Maidan, but I've always been wondering, and I've seen how much students struggle in Mumbai. So I'm just wondering, is that a very private role, or do urban planners or anybody outside, just the private entities have a role to play or a say in, how we plan and design or zone for some of these things?
So I can do a quick thing and try and answer very briefly both those before these guys also respond. As far as planning in what the nomenclature is informal parts of the city, but the problem here is informal implies illegal. It makes it very difficult for a city government to intervene. So mostly you're relying on non-governmental organizations to take that up on a project basis, which is also fraught with problems because then there are localized resentments and jealousies. Why my street? Why not that street? So on and so forth. So that is one thing, is that the bigger challenge is to get a document like the master plan to recognize that an informal system of occupation, settlement, temporal occupation or temporary occupation is not necessarily illegal. What it actually is that you don't have complicated enough laws that can service that occupation. So it's the problem of oversimplification. Housing, I strongly believe, is a market force related economic activity. In India, in a city, a home is not, below a certain income point, a home is a capital asset. It needs to be understood like that. It needs to be allowed to form and grow as that. So in many ways, students' housing, I can vouch for this in Delhi. I don't know what the situation here, because the real estate market here is very different. There are two things that like I said, Delhi is controlled by the central government, so there are many national ambitions that are national that are kind of dumped on us. But I've often found, like, I've noticed this in the past 10 years, there are many more co-living spaces that before even the co-working cycle started, where people had gradually converted an entire house into what used to be called in the 70s. I believe there are some romantic movies also made along the theme of a paying guest, right? Where you invite usually a young man into the home, and then, romances develop. So these sorts of notions are fluid, they will change, and as designers, we need to kind of keep our eye out. So this is my brief.
I'd just like to add about student housing. We do a lot of housing for IIT Bombay and many other institutions in Bombay. It is very tight, dense plans, but they are certainly thinking about it. So are the government organizations. But you're absolutely right. From a city perspective, we are really not supporting students and how they live. As he said, the real estate market is always challenging, but it's certainly something we have to look at. But I know that institutions are looking at it, and we certainly are planning for it.
But thank you so much, Madhav, Kunal, Giulia, Nandini, and Christian. This was a very exciting and very insightful conversation.